Hello everyone, and welcome to our special panel to honour the work and contribution of Dr. Annie Austin, Caring About Wellbeing, a Concept for Positive Change. My name is Yeandle. I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Sheffield, and I'm the Principal Investigator for the Sustainable Care Connecting People and Systems programme, which is the organiser of this conference, Care Challenges and Solutions for a Sustainable Future. Dr. Annie Austin, our late colleague who died in September 2020, was awarded her PhD in 2015 by the University of Manchester for her thesis, Hard Times and Capabilities, the Effects of Economic Crisis on Wellbeing in the UK. Annie also had a first-class degree in Philosophy and Hispanic Studies awarded by King's College London in 2004, an MSc in Development Studies awarded by the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2006, and a second MSc in Social Change awarded with distinction in 2011 from the University of Manchester. Following her PhD between 2015 and 2019, Annie was postdoctoral research associate at the University of Manchester, researching first child wellbeing and disadvantage, and then as principal investigator, living well with dementia. Annie joined the Sustainable Care Programme in September 2019, attached to our combining work and care team, and worked closely in the following months with our colleague, Professor Jason Hayes. Annie published articles in the journals Social Indicators Research, the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, and Public Health Ethics. She authored a chapter in Wellbeing in Politics and Policy, the book edited by two of today's panellists, Ian Bache and Karen Scott, and she was first author of the major report, Dementia, Vulnerability and Wellbeing, Living Well with Dementia Together, and Supporting Working Carers, How Employers and Employees Can Benefit. A further very important contribution to the scholarly community was Annie's sole authored book, A Universal Declaration of Wellbeing, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. There is so much to celebrate about Annie, albeit all who knew her mourn her passing and the huge loss those closest to her must feel. I first met Annie in May 2019 at Interview. I was chairing the panel. On paper, she'd looked a great candidate and she did not disappoint. Annie's clarity of thought, her passion for her chosen areas of study, her energy and wit were immediately evident. It was an easy decision, and I was delighted when Annie accepted our invitation to join the Sustainable Care team. Annie later told me how bittersweet that week was for her. Within days, she also learned that she would need more treatment and would have to delay her start date. On joining us in September 2019, Annie immediately impressed us all. By the 17th of October, we were able to publish her first Sustainable Care Programme blog, Caring About Care, on our website. In it, she pointed out approvingly that centuries ago, Aristotle had said that caring relations are not only a necessary thing, but a splendid one. Annie went on to write about the work she'd done on the Living Well with Dementia Together project at the University of Manchester, commenting that a local authority policy commissioner she had spoken with had remarked, "We need our communities to be dementia friendly, but also Parkinson's friendly, carer friendly, just friendly." Annie added, "I thought this was a lovely nutshell summary of the importance of building on an infrastructure of sociality and care that would enable all of us to live well together." In what would prove to be the short time left to her, Annie contributed a fine piece of work to the Sustainable Care Programme. With Jason Hayes, she gave us a major output for our combining work and care work package and data that we continue to use to try to influence decision-making, including in the current debate in the UK about the introduction of carers' leave. Annie was a glorious person to be with, even in a work setting. She was open, courageous, thoughtful, and original. We've arranged this panel to celebrate her contribution to scholarly work on wellbeing, care, and ethics with the generous endorsement of Annie's husband, Stephen Jeffers, Jeff to her, and in the knowledge that one day their young son, Joe, will learn something of his mother's enduring and highly regarded contribution to our field from listening to today's recording. We hope everyone listening will find inspiration in Annie's work. In her book, A Universal Declaration of Wellbeing, published in 2020, the year that Annie died, she emphasises that the biggest lesson for politics and policy is that the journey beyond GDP should be directed towards building a sound infrastructure of sociality to underpin well-being. She concludes her book by saying, politics and policy in the 20th century erroneously inverted the means and ends of human well-being. Prioritising wealth and GDP as the most important end often left people as mere means to achieving a sound economy. Putting this error right requires a shift from an economic conception of the good to a social conception of the good. Much of the work of researchers on care and of the contributors to this conference is, I know, directed towards building a sound infrastructure of sociality to underpin and catalyse human well-being, the final phrase of Annie's book. These are things that Annie valued and that gave meaning to her life and her work. Our panellists have agreed to reflect upon and to share some of what her work means to them. I hope it will inspire continuing interest in her important and lasting contribution. I therefore now have great pleasure in introducing our panellists, Karen Scott, Ian Bache, Tania Burchardt and Patrick Hall. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, leaving time for discussion. As audience members, please think about what you'd like to ask or to say and put these points in the chat as we go along. When all panellists have spoken, I will then invite them to engage with your comments as well as to talk to each other. I'm going to introduce all of the panellists at the beginning so that I do not need to interrupt the flow of their contributions. So I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak, beginning with Dr. Karen Scott. Dr. Karen Scott is Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Exeter, where she contributes to the Environment and Sustainability Institute. Karen has researched the measurement of quality of life and well-being for public policy in the UK, in the USA and in New Zealand, and she supports local and central government to improve evidence for public policy on well-being and sustainability. Karen's research has informed the work of the UK's Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and the ESRC's Centre for Evaluating Complexity Across the Nexus. She is co-editor of the book series, The Politics and Policy of Wellbeing, and her own publications include Measuring Wellbeing Towards Sustainability, published in 2012, and The Politics of Wellbeing, Theory, Policy and Practice, published in 2018. Next up will be Ian Bache. Ian is Professor of Politics and co-director of the Centre for Wellbeing in Public Policy at the University of Sheffield, and he is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Ian led the ESRC seminar series on the politics of wellbeing from 2013 to 2015, prior to working on the Community Wellbeing Evidence Programme at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing in the UK. Ian's publications include Evidence, Policy and Wellbeing, which he published last year, The Politics of Wellbeing, Theory, Policy and Practice, co-edited with Karen Scott, which I've already mentioned, and The Politics and Policy of Wellbeing, Understanding the Rise and Significance of a New Agenda, which he co-authored in 2016 with Louise Reardon. Our third panellist is Dr. Tania Burchardt. Tania is Associate Director at the Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion and an Associate Professor in the Department of Social Policy at the London School of Economics. Tania's research focuses on theories of justice, the capability approach, measurement of inequality, and applied welfare policy analysis. Tania has worked with the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission, working with them to produce an equality measurement framework, and has researched distributional outcomes and intra-household allocation of resources. With colleagues, she is currently exploring scope for public consensus on a riches line, a level of standard of living considered excessive or unnecessary. Finally, I'd like to introduce our fourth panellist, our very own Patrick Hall. Patrick is a research fellow in the Sustainable Care Programme, and he holds positions at the University of Birmingham and the University of Sheffield. Patrick was formerly a fellow at the King's Fund, where in 2016 he co-authored Social Care for Older People, Home Truths, And his recent co-authored publications published in peer-reviewed journals include A Lost Decade, A Renewed Case for an Adult Social Care Reform in England, and An Idea Whose Time Has Not Yet Come, Government Positions on Long-Term Care in England Since 1999. Patrick's monograph with our colleague Catherine Needham on the UK's 4 national social care systems is due to be published within the next year by the Policy Press. So, as you can see, we have a fine and accomplished panel to discuss Annie's work. We are going to hear first from Karen Scott, and as I mentioned, please do put comments, questions, or anything you would like to say into the chat so that we can bring that into the discussion at the end of our panelists' contributions. I'm now give the floor to Karen Scott.
Thank you very much, Sue. I first met Annie in 2013 when she participated in an ESRC seminar series, The Politics of Wellbeing, that Ian and I organised with Charles Seaford from New Economics Foundation. Annie came to all 6 events over a 2-year period, and I got to know her, and we shared a few discussions outside those sessions on feminist critiques of current wellbeing agendas. On a personal level, I liked Annie very much. She had a seriously sharp intellect and a fierce streak of goodness, both of which came through in her own intellectual contributions, but also in her insightful and generous comments on the work of others. And I was really happy to be invited here today to celebrate her work. I'm going to talk about Annie's book, A Universal Declaration of Human Wellbeing, published last year. This is part of the Palgrave Macmillan book series, Wellbeing in Politics and Policy, that Ian and I edit along with Paul Allen. When Annie submitted her manuscript, it allowed us to get to know her work in a more in-depth way. And her submission was a joy for us editors because we all agreed that very little needed doing to it. It was so well written, thoroughly researched and thought out. The aim of her book is, in her words, to identify the commonalities that emerge from different theoretical and practical accounts of well-being. I intend to demonstrate that there is a core of well-being that is universal, but expressed distinctively in different cultural contexts. This is evidently true for the basic needs of human physical survival, such as food and shelter. However, this book is not about the universals of life, but the universals of a good life. In Annie's desire to be genuinely international, inclusive and reflective when looking at different wellbeing accounts, she tackles head-on the inherent difficulties of universalist declarations of values, especially in post-colonial contexts, making it clear where she stands. As she says, differences in cultural values are often cited as reasons for conflict and a lack of integration and understanding between people from different countries, and between different communities within the same countries. Indeed, the defence and promotion of British values has featured prominently in British political discourse in recent years, and exclusionary political discourses around our values have also found foothold in other countries, notably the Netherlands and the USA. There are many books on wellbeing, but very few have this ambition of reviewing and comparing worldwide conceptions of the good, and even fewer are so genuinely inclusive, often othering various cultures against a Eurocentric or Anglophone liberal norm. From the first paragraph of the book, her inclusivity is clear, as she gives equal gaze to the manifestos of political parties and constitutions from the US, Kenya, Spain, and Japan. Despite the incredible cultural diversity on how well-being is conceptualized across the globe, she's very clear in her hypothesis that there is a universal core of human well-being and that the elements of this universal core are discoverable. The ultimate goal of the book is to identify the elements of this core of well-being as a tool for people-centred politics and policy. On reading her book again in preparation for this panel, I was struck anew by the ambition of this project. She investigates both theoretical inquiry and empirical knowledge on well-being from around the world and from ancient to modern times. In her theoretical inquiries, she analyses the ancient philosophical roots of the good life from China, India, Greece, and the Middle East, including Hindu texts and the work of Confucius, Aristotle, and Avicenna. She incorporates more contemporary ideas from philosophers John Rawls, Amartya Sen, and Martha Nussbaum, whose work also inform her framework of analysis, using the capability approach and the concepts of reflective equilibrium and overlapping consensus. She also conducted an analysis of empirical data, including a comparative documentary analysis of political constitutions around the world, contemporary political initiatives, around well-being, and finally an analysis of the World Values Survey. Not only that, but she developed and employed a clear methodology to distill all this diverse philosophical and empirical inquiry into a practical set of universal well-being dimensions. Furthermore, she elaborates on how this set adds richness to existing well-being frameworks and makes clear recommendations for policy. Unfeasibly, she pulls all of this off very successfully. I know that Tania is going to talk a little bit later about the universal well-being dimensions that Annie came up with and the contribution of her book for some policy areas. But I'd like to dive a little bit more into her discussion of different cultures and her desire to understand well-being internationally. I think this shows very clearly Annie's commitment to being a good researcher, both in a quality sense, but also in an ethical sense, and her strong sense of social justice. When reviewing different countries, she includes a genuinely diverse range of well-being philosophies and concepts from Bhutan, Bolivia, Canada, China, Ecuador, Ghana, India, Morocco, Qatar, Rwanda, and the US, to name some, alongside a discussion of European and Nordic well-being conceptions. It would be impossible to do justice to all this here, but I'd like to focus on her discussion of the sub-Saharan concept of Ubuntu. This philosophy is generally characterized as meaning, I am because we are, and the ontological core of this is the interconnectedness of life. As Annie says, this worldview advocates a profound sense of interdependence and emphasizes that our true human potential can only be realized in partnership with others. She finds clear links between Ubuntu and with Aristotelian ethics on two counts. Firstly, in terms of the sociality at the core of both of these accounts, that well-being is a matter of a person being and doing well in the social world. Secondly, she draws attention to the importance of virtue ethics and highlights the importance of the moral qualities of a person in the concept of Ubuntu. She quotes Desmond Tutu, who characterized this a person who possesses Ubuntu as a generous, hospitable, friendly, caring, and compassionate person. And he also sees connections to communitarian and feminist ethics. First, communitarianism and Ubuntu, she says, share an emphasis on the importance of community as a fact of life and as a necessary part of a good human life, an indispensable factor in ethical reasoning about the good life and the good society. The Ubuntu conception of the person as an inherently social being, defined not by her interdependence, but by her interdependence and caring relationships with others, is also found in feminist ethics. When Ubuntu is discussed by Western scholars, there is a danger of reductionist and romanticized accounts. I really like the way that Tania brought attention to the fact that Ubuntu is a complex concept, which is interpreted differently across many nations within the African continent. She's also clear on the ways that misinterpretation of Ubuntu in the English-speaking world has the potential for misuse. What I really appreciated, though, was the fact that she points out the difficulty of translating Ubuntu into modern political conceptions in African nations. Ubuntu as a concept was widely used by Mandela and Tutu to promote the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa after apartheid, but this was criticised heavily by some African scholars. It's important to engage with those literatures of critique to fully understand and pay respect to these complexities. To sum up, Annie's clear writing style, discussion of philosophy and values, her methods of critical analysis, and the exceptional international scope of this book provide a range of learning and discussion opportunities for students. Both Ian, who's speaking next, and I include this on our reading lists in our modules on wellbeing. Annie's book is also important for researchers in this field, and I will revisit it several times, no doubt, in the coming years. It's a very useful reference, yes, but it's also, personally speaking, quite inspiring, and more so knowing now what she must have been going through as she was writing it. For many reasons, it deserves our attention. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much indeed, Karen. I'm now going to move straight on to invite Ian Bache to make his contribution.
Thank you, Sue, and thanks very much for inviting me to do this. I'm very pleased to be part of this. So like Karen, I first met Annie about 8 years ago when she got involved with the seminar series on the politics of wellbeing that Karen mentioned. And at that time, the politics discipline has shown relatively little interest in the rise of wellbeing in policy circles. So in that context, the series aimed to identify and communicate the distinctive contribution of the discipline, both theoretically and in practice. It's no exaggeration to say that Annie was a key contributor to the success of the series. She participated in all 5 seminars, presented a paper at one, and chaired one of the sessions at the final conference. She also contributed a chapter to the edited collection that came out of the project and a volume to the book series that Karen has just talked about. Annie also spoke on one of the Political Studies Association panels that we organised, giving a presentation on the paper that I'm going to speak about today. The paper is called On Wellbeing and Public Policy: Are We Capable of Questioning the Hegemony of Happiness? And the paper was published in Social Indicators Research in 2016. Annie and I had various discussions about the paper, and it's fair to say that she shaped my views on the issues it dealt with far more than I did hers. She was very clear and persuasive, and she knew that she was onto something. So let me turn to the paper. The background to the paper is the rise in political interest in wellbeing and the emergence of national wellbeing measurement frameworks. The article discusses the debate about how national wellbeing is defined and measured, and offers a critical review of the main schools of thought. In particular, it's concerned with the move towards an emphasis on measuring individual well-being, and in particular, individual psychological states. It identifies a strong position on this emerging, one that holds that subjective well-being can represent, in a single indicator, a summary of how people's lives are going, and that in both the academic and policy arenas, the term well-being is often used simply to refer to the psychological state of happiness or life satisfaction. The paper suggests that this is a far from satisfactory situation and puts forward the Aristotelian capabilities approach as a sounder basis for the design and appraisal of public policy. So let me drill down into some of the details a bit more. In the subjective wellbeing approach, positive outcomes in domains such as health, wealth, and social connectedness are related instrumentally to wellbeing. This means that such things are valued only to the extent that they contribute to the ultimate goal of a pleasurable subjective state. The paper notes that within key government departments, subjective wellbeing has been increasingly used as a yardstick for planning and evaluating policy. In this approach, policies are valued according to their contribution to average subjective well-being. The recommended aim is the greatest happiness of the greatest number, with public funds to be allocated on this basis. As such, the default definition of well-being among British policy actors has become a subjective definition. So when the term well-being is used, it implicitly refers to subjective well-being, to the extent that alternative meanings of well-being are not even considered. So in sum, a hegemony of happiness has emerged. The paper identifies a number of objections to the subjective account of well-being that call into question its usefulness as a policy yardstick. The principal objections relate to instrumentalism and individualism, to measurement issues, and to the problem of adaptive preferences, with this last point considered by many to be the fatal flaw in subjective accounts of well-being. And I'll say a bit more about some of these objections. I've already touched on the instrumental objection, which is that aspects of life that matter to people are seen as merely causal contributors to the ultimate goal of a pleasurable subjective state. The individualistic objection focuses on the transfer of responsibility for well-being away from collective social institutions and onto citizens as individuals. This suggests that subjective approaches risk paying insufficient attention to the structural causes of well-being and ill-being. But the most serious objection is the problem of adaptive preferences. According to this argument, some objective benchmark of well-being is necessary because human beings adapt to external circumstances. For example, very poor or disadvantaged people may adapt to their deprivation and be perfectly happy, but could not reasonably be said to be flourishing as human beings. So in contrast, the paper argues for a multidimensional conception of value in which specific domains like good health, material security, and social and political participation are valued intrinsically as essential components of well-being. The paper adopts a social definition of well-being, which recognises that personal and social identities are mutually constituted and that well-being occurs within social relationships of interdependence. This approach, while acknowledging the importance of individual self-determination and freedom, places equally high priority on the role of underlying structural processes in what people are capable of being and doing. The paper is important for two main reasons. First, while it recognises that how people feel about their own lives is an important element of a definition of national well-being, it shows why subjective well-being alone is not a reliable public policy yardstick. It may mask important variation in the objective quality of people's lives and their freedom to flourish. And at worst, it could perpetuate the underlying causes of inequality and disadvantage. Second, the paper shows how subjective well-being has moved towards hegemonic status within UK government departments and explains why this has happened. The roots of the subjective well-being approach in the classical liberal paradigm fit neatly into the dominant neoliberal worldview and provides a simple headline metric that lends itself well to the standard methods of cost-benefit analysis and the planning and evaluation of public policy. And this is perhaps the most important point. That while academics and others have long argued over the pros and cons of different ways of defining and measuring well-being, well-being has now moved into policy. This is no longer purely an academic exercise, but now informs decisions that affect people's lives. This is why this paper really matters, and this is why Annie cared about it so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was a very thought-provoking and a contribution, and thank you so much for drawing attention to that important article that Annie has given us. Can I now turn to Tania Burchardt, who is going to be our third contributor?
Hello, thank you very much. I didn't know Annie as well as many of the people who are participating in today's event, but I did have the honour of examining her PhD in 2015, and we stayed in touch thereafter, and I watched with great interest and admiration as her career developed thereafter. There are some people who make a vivid impression on one, even though one's contact with them is limited, and Annie was such a person. Her warmth, her liveliness, her intellect, her ability to reach across disciplines and academic boundaries, and perhaps most of all, her determination to make a contribution in whatever way she could. These were truly exceptional qualities. Karen has already spoken about Annie's book, A Universal Declaration of Human Wellbeing, that built on some of the arguments in her PhD and later work. I'd like to pick up on a couple of aspects of that and reflect on their relevance to public debate and policy today. As Karen has said, Annie sought answers to some fundamental questions. What do we have reason to value? What is well-being? And she did so by searching diverse systems of thought and practices across the sweep of human history and across the globe to seek a common core, that universal of the book's title. Many dimensions of what Annie characterises in the final part of the book as universal well-being are reassuringly familiar to social scientists like myself who work on the capability approach. So we read in Annie's account about material security, safety, meaning physical safety and security, health, subjective well-being that Ian's just spoken about, meaningful work and leisure, education and political participation. In addition, Annie identifies significant dimensions that typically receive much less attention in empirical applications, such as engagement with the natural environment, cultural participation, relational autonomy, and relational integrity, which Annie fleshes out as being able to live in accordance with one's basic convictions about what matters most in life. Importantly, though, Annie goes beyond a simple list to argue that one dimension is the most fundamental. All the dimensions, she argues, are grounded in meaningful, mutually respectful social connections. These connections she sees operating at every level, from the family through community to formal institutions. The identification of a unifying dimension of well-being is a distinctive contribution of Annie's analysis. And the fact that it is derived from such a far-reaching and multifaceted review of evidence on what people actually value gives this tremendous strength. This emphasis on social connectedness has considerable relevance to contemporary academic and public debates. And I'll highlight three issues, although of course there are many more that one could discuss. Firstly, in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. As a number of commentators have observed, the significance of social connections for well-being has been revealed through our experience of the last 14 months or so, and the policy responses to the pandemic itself. When something becomes severely restricted, we realise how much we need it. And as Annie articulated, this connectedness, this social connectedness, is important not only at the most intimate level between friends and family, but also in communities. 10 million people are known to have volunteered in the UK during the first wave of the pandemic, helping out in the NHS, setting up neighbourhood organisations, collecting and distributing food parcels, and so on. And those 10 million are just the people we know about. Many more will have been supporting friends and neighbours without any formal role or recognition. Crucially, and at their best, these relationships are built on mutuality and respect. Research by my colleagues Anne Power and Ellie Benton suggests that many people involved in these mutual aid organisations would like to continue this work, these activities, post-pandemic. But the interface with existing structures is often problematic. Members of these groups talk about the need for funding, the need for in-kind support and training, for example, by local authorities. And they also talk about the frustrations of being tied in knots by bureaucracy or being sidelined or ignored by private and public service providers. This speaks directly to Annie's call for formal institutions to support rather than undermine social connectedness. Of course, formal institutions need not only to support other organisations that are fostering social connectedness, they also need to embed those values themselves. And this brings me to my second aspect of contemporary public debate that I wanted to briefly discuss, and that is the new agenda for a values-based social policy. Karen from the panel today has written elsewhere about whether Building Back Better might provide the window of opportunity for a step change towards incorporating multidimensional well-being as the goal of policy making in a more thoroughgoing way, displacing the traditional focus on economic growth. As some of you will know, this Beyond GDP movement, which Annie also writes about in her book, has gained considerable momentum over the last decade, with New Zealand, for example, adopting a wellbeing budget underpinned by a sophisticated conceptual and measurement framework. As well as reflecting the multidimensional account of well-being that Annie justifies so comprehensively in her book, one emerging part of this agenda in the UK is a dawning recognition that it matters to specify the values which will govern policy making in a particular area, as well as the desired outcomes. Thus, we've seen dignity and respect enshrined as fundamental values in the NHS Constitution, which talks about respect, dignity, compassion and care as being at the core of how patients and staff should be treated. It's also articulated as a guiding principle in the Social Security Act in Scotland, and widely discussed in diverse areas such as policing, social care and employment services. Of course, the real test is not just whether these commitments are made rhetorically, but also whether they're translated into effective policies and everyday practices. The Social Policies and Distributional Outcomes programme that I've been part of, led by Polly Vizard at the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion, identified values-based social policy as one of 5 key challenges for the UK in the 2020s. The third and final aspect of the current context I wanted to highlight as an example of how important Annie's analysis is to public debate is the tendencies that we see towards division and polarisation. We're seeing a high degree of political polarisation in many countries, spearheaded, for example, by Trumpism in the US, which, despite the fact that he's no longer president, is still alive and well as a movement, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duda in Poland, Brexit and nationalist politics in the UK. The strategies of these leaders and campaigns are premised on identifying and exploiting difference between hardworking people, supposedly, and the rest, the majority and the minority, straight and gay citizens and migrants. Even before the pandemic, hardening borders, restricting the movement of people, was increasingly seen as a policy response to the pressures arising from global inequalities and the effects of conflict and climate change on people's livelihoods. Annie's analysis is a powerful antidote to these polarising tendencies. She reminds us of the fundamental commonality of our humanity. We may have different religions, traditions and beliefs, and our needs may be met through different specific commodities and practices. But at a foundational level, what we need and what we value is the same. It is indeed universal. To conclude, Annie's book is a tour de force, but its beating heart is deeply personal. The conclusion that Annie reached through her engagement with thousands of years of human thought from every corner of the globe was that good social relationships are a necessary condition of all the other constituents of a good life. And Annie exemplified this principle in her own way of being, with strangers, colleagues, friends and family. She also discovered, through her research, that family was consistently ranked as one of the very highest value by citizens across countries and continents. And I have no doubt that this too resonated with Annie's own conviction and practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tania, for that thoughtful and inspiring contribution, and for drawing our attention to those important aspects of Annie's work. Can I just remind, before I introduce Patrick, can I just remind those of you who are on the stage, part of the platform, hearing what's being said, to make comments and ask questions if you have things that you would like to say, or perhaps to contribute an example which you feel exemplifies some of the points which we've drawn attention to from Annie's work. I'm pleased now to introduce Patrick Hall. Patrick Hall is going to speak to us about some of the aspects of wellbeing that relate to care and other aspects of policy that we've been studying in the Sustainable Care Programme. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Sue. And I just want to start by saying how humbled I am to be part of this panel today with, such a fantastic group of speakers. As an early career researcher myself and a member of the Sustainable Care team, it's just been a really fascinating discussion today, and really gets to the heart of some of the things that we've been trying to look at in the Sustainable Care Programme. So I'm going to talk today briefly about how the concept of wellbeing appears in UK social care policy across the 4 administrations. Some quick reflections on that, but I'll also touch on Annie's work on the Sustainable Care Programme on combining work and care. I met Annie only a few times at the University of Sheffield and at some of the events we've put on as part of the Sustainable Care Programme. And Sue had told me that Annie had an interest in philosophy and Aristotle, and I was, really excited as I did my undergraduate in philosophy, and was kind of overly excited to talk to her about Aristotle and Alistair McIntyre and how that all relates to social care policy. And I think I kind of just talked at her, and she really, really kindly humoured me, given that I've now read her work and realised how gracious she was in our conversations, given that I was largely, very inarticulately wrestling with ideas that she'd already considered in great detail. In fact, she'd written a book about them. So thanks for your generosity, Annie. So I'm going to talk about wellbeing. So wellbeing has been a big part of adult social care policy discourse since the early 2000s. And of course, specifically in government policy under the coalition government since 2011, although there is reference to wellbeing in social care policy as early as 1968 in the CBOM report. It has sat, or now sits kind of alongside meeting need as the aim, the normative aim of social care departments, providers and commissioners ever since, and has now emerged more broadly in major pieces of social care legislation as guiding duties of local government. However, while the inclusion of wellbeing in care legislation has driven some social care departments to try and work in ways that attempt to build what Annie calls the infrastructure of sociality, some have integrated the discourse into existing functionalist approaches to providing a narrow set of services to carry on meeting a narrow set of eligible needs, which of course has helped them to reduce outlay in the context of austerity and national funding reductions. The 4 nations of the UK have taken slightly different approaches to wellbeing in their legislative frameworks of social care. In England, wellbeing forms the core duty of the Care Act 2014. It takes what's often labelled a kind of component outcomes approach to defining the goal of local authorities as the achievement of wellbeing outcomes. So this includes outcomes such as physical, mental health, dignity, protection from abuse, control, relationships, participation in activities in the community, in workplaces, as well as kind of broader social, emotional and economic well-being. In Scotland, the well-being agenda is less explicitly present in social care legislation, with more emphasis there being placed on self-directed support, meeting of needs, development of a human rights approach. However, local authorities and local government do operate in an environment which must take reasonable steps to respect dignity and right to participate in community life, which in some ways aligns with some of the wellbeing outcomes used in the other UK nations. In Northern Ireland, obviously, the absence of a functioning government means that the concept doesn't appear in legislation. It does in policy and in the aims of the Department of Health, which outline its aim of creating a new model of person-centred care focused on prevention, supporting independence and well-being. So, personal capabilities are emphasised in social care policy in Northern Ireland, but we're yet to see that manifest in legislation. In Wales, well-being in social care policy is defined in similar terms to the English definition, but adds securing rights and entitlements, and importantly, the opportunity to speak Welsh and to promote community resilience and coherence. Welsh social policy, I think, has attempted to meld the concepts of well-being and sustainability in its Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which attempts to build a broader policy making around its long-term perspective and incorporate a context-sensitive approach. The inclusion of Welsh-speaking and cohesive communities is an attempt to build in a sense of belonging into the concept of well-being. And I think that's something that really comes out of Annie's book. She says that in the Universal Declaration of Human Well-being that belonging and sociality ground well-being, these other well-being characteristics in sharing of identities and interests, and ends with others. I mean, it's not just a simple case of individual well-being outcomes, but that belonging grounds those outcomes as shared with others. So for me, Wales goes furthest in legislation in attempting to build a more cohesive and social Welsh community. So well-being in adult social care acts as a motivation for some local authorities to consider the broader impact of people who need, the broader impact of the lives of people who have needs for care and support and their carers. And with carers, obviously, that is especially important with regard to the difficult job of juggling employment and care. And often they have failed to intervene effectively to support them as local authorities. So well-being for me can't just be delivered as a project of local government. It has to be a genuine social partnership with intermediate organisations, the third sector, and importantly, employers. And I think that this is what's demonstrated by Annie's work with Professor Jason Hayes on the Sustainable Care Programme. So Annie's report presented detailed findings of the first UK study based on a representative sample of working carers. The report shows that there's a significant gap in employer support for working carers in England and Wales. A third of working carers believe that their employer provides them with no support of any kind, and only 2/5 of working carers believe that their employer is carer friendly. Many working carers are coping with their care responsibilities by working weekends and evenings, using their annual leave to provide care or taking unpaid leave. The effort to combine work and care can result in stress, anxiety, and low well-being, and affects the ability of working carers to perform well in their jobs. So, again, the well-being challenge goes well beyond what the state can deliver alone. Employer-provided support is vital in addressing the problems for working carers. The findings presented in the report showed that working carers who are supported by their employers are able to more easily combine paid employment with unpaid caring, resulting in positive impacts on their work, on their ability to care and maintain relationships, and on their individual well-being. I'll be starting my doctoral studies this year, inspired by Annie's work, which I think bridges the gap between the philosophy of the good life and the social care policy and commissioning world, which I've long been a part of, and I hope that I can do her work justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you for reflecting both in a personal way but also on different dimensions of the work that we're conducting in the Sustainable Care Connecting People and Systems programme in your remarks. I thought there were some very thoughtful insights there, and as you will be aware, and many of the others in the team who are on this call, I'm sure, thinking about how well-being connects with sustainability in relation to care has been something that we've known was important right from the beginning of the work we've been doing together on the programme, but we've been grappling with it as we go along. And Annie's insights and those of the other speakers on this panel this morning have been and will continue to be really important to us as we draw conclusions and make both our theoretical and our empirical contributions and seek to influence and have an impact upon policy making and practice in care in the coming months as we conclude the work of our current programme. So thanks very much to all of the panellists. I'd like to ask if we could bring all the panellists back on screen so that we can speak together. And I'm going to start by asking the panellists to respond to a question which has been put into the chat by Tristan Brown. He points out that Annie's proposal has been that we should move as a society from a focus of people serving the economy to actually the economy serving people and everyone's well-being, and draws attention to her emphasis on the importance of inclusivity as we do this, asking, and perhaps panellists can think about how they'd like to respond to this, how can we move this up the policy agenda in contemporary societies? All of you are studying not only the UK, but some other countries as well. And some of you have mentioned places where this is perhaps this has been moved forward more than is the case in the four nations of the UK. But perhaps you'd like to reflect on that. Who would like to go first in speaking about how we might, Karen?
I'll jump in. So I think that it is moving up the policy agenda. But I think, I mean, in reference to Ian's work, which perhaps he might like to mention in a minute, there often needs to be a sort of a really big impetus to get things moving in policy. So, for example, I've done some work in New Zealand, and one of the drivers of things changing in New Zealand was the activism of the Maori people in terms of their human rights and the setting up of the Waitangi Tribunal in the 70s and the activism since then to get reparation for all of the injustices done to the Maori by white settlers in New Zealand. And as that movement grew and as that became politically legitimised and formalised, then the necessity to recognise Maori cultural conceptions of well-being, which are quite different to sort of imported Western conceptions of well-being, really necessitated a very deep discussion at a policy level and the setting up of some quite radical well-being policies and dimensions. So there is now a separate set of Maori well-being indicators and a sort of, you know, mainstream set, if you like, for want of a better word. But gradually those are sort of, you know, merging and influencing each other. And of course, now there's a politician at the head of the country who's very into well-being, and so that's another driver. And if you look at places like Finland, Iceland, and Scotland, whose leaders have all made very strong commitments to well-being governments, well-being economies, and well-being agendas, then the discourse is coming, and hopefully the practical implementation of that will follow. But there has to be some sort of cultural shift, I think, first. So I'll stop there. There's more I could say. But...
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Karen. Ian, you'd like to come in?
Just to follow on from Karen, I think that political leadership is obviously really important. So when you think about New Zealand and the first wellbeing budget, I mean, it's got a lot to do with the leadership and the contextual factors are part of that. I guess a crisis always provides an opportunity for significant change, and we're hopefully coming out of one now. So it provides an opportunity, but the key is how is this crisis going to be framed? What's going to be the successful and dominant framing of this crisis? Is it a crisis of health and well-being? Well, yes. Is it a crisis? Is it an economic crisis? Well, yes. Which arguments are we now in the longer term? What will the collective memory be going forward about the nature of this problem and how we should respond to it? So we'd like to think that's an opportunity. Karen's written about how we will build back better and whether this will lead to something of a substantive shift. And we both kind of looked at what happened after the financial and economic crisis kicking off in 2007, 2008. Around that time, that was seen to provide this window of opportunity for something radical, a shift. And at the time, immediately after the crisis, or the early years of the crisis, people were talking about, we've got our goals wrong, we're measuring the wrong things, we need to go in a different direction. But very quickly that narrative changed to being, this is an economic crisis, this is a debt crisis, and in the UK, the response is austerity. So I don't want to be sort of too negative, but what I want to say is that, a crisis provides an opportunity for different ideas to come forward. And within that framework, I think political leadership is crucial. So we'll see how that works. And clearly that the wider social movements that people have talked about, giving voice to the ideas is important. And also public opinion and the national mood, which at the moment in the UK is telling us that most people value happiness and well-being above anything else. And if that keeps being the case, then ultimately political leaders might have to respond. So early stages, but I think that they're the kind of things that matter.
Thank you very much, Ian. Tania, do you want to comment on that? And there's also a question for you, but go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Sue. Yeah, so I absolutely echo what Karen and Ian have said about the idea that this may be a critical juncture where a really substantial shift could take place, although equally echo what they've both said about there being nothing that can be taken for granted there. It does seem to me that one key in achieving this shift is to move from just rhetorical commitments and discussion to changes in resource allocation. That's such a major driver of policy, where the money goes. So engaging with, in this country, for example, the Treasury and central parts of government like the Cabinet Office seem to me absolutely key, not just with the perhaps friendlier parts of government that are already to a greater or lesser extent signed up to a broader multidimensional agenda. And I think, as Karen mentioned, New Zealand is a very good example of how that shift has taken place, that it's now not only a commitment to thinking about multidimensional value, for example, but it's also embedded in a budgetary process. So I would see that as one key area for people who want to promote this agenda to target their attention.
Thanks, Tania. I'd like to ask you also to reflect on whether the Black Lives Matter movement and where that might go could have the kind of effect that Karen mentioned, the awareness and the mobilisation that arose from the Maori community in New Zealand had there. Do you see potential for that?
Well, yes, certainly, and it's I think no coincidence that we see this emerging at a point where other forms of inequality have also been becoming increasingly salient. So these kinds of mass mobilisation, I think history teaches us, can be extremely effective in achieving a shift, but again, with no necessary consequence of that, unless it is translated into political mobilisation as well.
Thank you. You've also got a question from someone in the chat, Tania, so I'll ask you to respond to that as well. The person says, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. Any thoughts on how to get formal institutions to support informal networks and social connectedness? Would you like to respond to that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent question, and very important to try and figure out. I think one of the things from research by my colleagues in the LSE Housing and Communities group on these mutual aid organisations specifically that have grown up in the context of the response to the pandemic is that often it's very small things that make a very big difference. So, for example, small grants, small numbers of thousands of pounds, for example, can really make the difference between a group managing to keep going and falling apart. Or simple things like public liability insurance. I mean, ridiculously sort of technical, but can be make or break for a small organisation. If something like the local authority has a disposition towards supporting these community level grassroots organisations and can put some infrastructure in place that gives them access to some of the local authorities' resources, even as I say, on a pretty small scale or sometimes no cost to the local authority other than just sort of paying a bit of attention, that can really make a difference. So I suppose it's partly an orientation towards thinking that these organisations are important, have a useful role to play, not perceived as a threat to the local authority or other formal institutions, but as partners in achieving the common goal of well-being. Partly that kind of conceptual shift that may need to take place. And then secondly, really quite small-scale practical things like access to small grants and training and things like that.
Thanks, Tania. I'll bring Patrick in a moment. That makes me think of what we've been saying, some of us researching unpaid care and the contributions made by family carers and by neighbours and friends to our care system for a long time, which is the support that carers often would value and which would make a huge difference in their lives is often not high cost. We're talking often about quite low level expectations, but which can make a transformative difference in some people's lives. And I think Annie's work on dementia will probably have highlighted some of those factors as well, that there are small things we can do, small changes we can all make in our everyday lives, and that need to be catalysed probably by government actions or by principles that are in place around how we govern local communities that could really make a difference there. Patrick, you wanted to come in, and then I've got a couple of points I wanted to ask you about as well, but make your contribution.
Sure.
In response to Tania's.
Yeah, I just wanted to develop what Tania was saying, but kind of related to adult social care policy over the past 10, 15 years. I mean, I think adult social care policy, you know, while there are lots of examples of local authorities that haven't used the wellbeing agenda to try and promote this informal infrastructure of sociality, there are a lot of examples of where it has been attempted and lots of lessons to be learned. So, you know, I'd point to the work of organisations like Community Catalysts. So, you know, providing an infrastructure for micro enterprises, for, you know, people who have one or two employees that work in an informal and formal care capacity within often more rural parts of England, Somerset, but also in places like Thurrock, they're doing lots of work to promote micro enterprise shared lives, home share arrangements, and kind of partnership in commissioning practices, and the adoption of co-production, ways to try and bring people who use services into the governance of adult social care in local authorities. So I think adult social care across England and Wales in particular does point to kind of small and underdeveloped aspects of that promotion by the state of informal networks. There's some interesting writing on that at the moment. So,
thank you very much, Patrick. I've got another question I wanted to ask you about, which was really my own question, which is about what the concept of sociality that Annie discusses in a lot of detail in her work, what's that got to offer the current dominant ageing in place agenda in the care of older people? I think we know that that's really now widely used around the world. It's incredibly dominant in North America. It's a focus across Europe. It's discussed in many other countries that we should be supporting people to live in their own homes rather than moving into thinking about residential or institutional care. But one of the consequences that we seem to have is almost a pandemic of isolation and loneliness. Mm. So how could we bring the sociality concept in there, do you think? And what do we need to adapt that or change or reject the ageing in place model?
Well, I think the ageing in place model, the ageing in place concept is probably more useful than our kind of stay at home, keeping people in their own homes concept as a kind of normative basis for adult social care policy, because it doesn't exclude those people for whom, their needs are so complex and great that they do need significant, they need significant support, both in hospital environments and perhaps in more institutional environments. But the ageing in place concept shows that actually, it is possible for people who have that level of complexity of need to be able to still live in a community, live in a place where they belong and they feel that they belong. Because I think that's one of the things that, Annie's book really brings down, is that, a kind of a belonging in a place in relationship with others is the ground of a kind of wider well-being. And I do think, I think there's been a greater visibility of people in places who need that kind of support as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And I think that, for people who, maybe would have spent all of their time commuting back and forth from work and, maybe working at home a little bit more, those people that are on their streets in their neighborhoods who need that kind of informal support have become a bit more visible. And I hope that translates into, some political momentum, which carries that forward. I do think some of the work that Demos and Danny Kruger have done recently on a new care commitment tries to promote that within the current parliament. So we'll see whether that has any impact on the potential of proposals that come out of the Queen's speech.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I'm now going to ask Karen if she would like to respond to a question from Polly Vizard. Polly says, Patrick highlighted wellbeing as an ultimate care goal in England against other approaches, including human rights-based approaches in Scotland. And she asks, how does Annie view the relationship between well-being and the idea of human rights in her book or in her other work? So I'll start with you, Karen, but others may want to comment on that as well.
Sorry, did you say how does she view well-being as opposed to human rights? I missed that.
Well, the relationship between the conceptualisation of well-being and the way she believes that could be articulated in policymaking and the idea of human rights in her book, or indeed in other work that she did.
So in terms of the impact on policy, Annie addresses that right at the end of the book. And really, as Tania's mentioned, she really brings out this idea of sociality, but also of integrity. So this comes from Martha Nussbaum's and earlier John Rawls' idea of having the capacity or the capability to really plan one's own life in accordance with one's own values, as Tania's highlighted in her talk there. And I think that's a really, really interesting aspect. And I was really pleased that Annie chose to focus on that in terms of her discussion on sociality. So we all have to have our own individual idea of our lives and what is a good life for us. But how do we then bring all of those individual concepts together to live a good life with other people in a caring and social way? And so I think that's an idea that's been grappled with, for a long time. But I think Annie addresses it in the sense that, she focuses on the capabilities approach, so that we focus not on rights, not on sort of subjective happiness, which tends to be a very individualistic conception often, but on the freedoms and capabilities of people to be and do what is good for them. And what is good for them, as Annie argues, is to be in social connections. So she makes a quite neat sort of circle of those things. And like many others, has argued that sort of, there's a false dichotomy often between liberal and communitarian conceptions of the good life, as Simon Caney has argued, a political philosopher. So I think that she's very much in that camp of, really sort of challenging the false dichotomies between those conceptions of well-being. And human rights is obviously very closely linked to the capabilities approach, but where some people might choose an ethical individualist approach to human rights, Annie might choose a more social attitude towards human rights, where we create our rights in social care with each other, and that's the value that underpins human rights. So I'll stop there. Other people might want to flesh out my inadequacies on that discussion.
Thank you, Carol. I think that you've made us all think about that, and I shall certainly go away and think more about that, because I think it's an important question and some important ideas that you've shared with us there. We've got a question from Catherine Needham, and I would, Tania, if you might pick this up, or perhaps it's a question also perhaps that Ian might be interested in. She asks, it's clear that getting wellbeing into legislation, as in England and Wales in care law, has really made very little difference to people's actual well-being, and particularly as delivered through our care systems. It becomes a symbolic goal, but little else. How do we move beyond it? And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. Tania, perhaps you'd like to start, and then I'll perhaps come to Ian.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, that obviously really goes to the heart of the issue about how to make this agenda make a difference, and that's an incredibly important point. One observation I would make is that we've really been running up the down escalator, haven't we, over the last 10 years or so, as far as social care in England is concerned, in that, as the resources have been squeezed and demand has risen, I feel almost whatever shift had been made in terms of the framing of policy in the context of that sort of squeeze, it's very unlikely that we would have seen improvements in well-being, however revolutionary the way in which those goals were set. So I think part of my answer is, again, coming back to the centrality of resources. It's kind of tedious, but I feel bears repetition, that unless the whole provision is sufficiently well funded, you're not going to be able to achieve improvements of a substantial kind in the well-being of the people that you're trying to support. Having said that, I think that the types of shift that we're talking about have considerable potential to make improvements without there being a higher price tag. So what I mean there is, at the moment we can think about many instances where resources are expended without anything to show for it in terms of well-being, in fact sometimes quite the opposite. Whereas an understanding based on sociality, social connectedness, such as Annie is promoting, supporting those kinds of unpaid carers and the kind of mutual aid that we've been discussing earlier, doesn't have to be very costly, as we've said, but does require a shift in thinking that is very difficult to bring about when the whole service is in a state of almost permanent crisis. So there's a sort of interaction there between the overall squeeze on resources, the inability to reconceptualize things during a period when a system is under crisis, and therefore the inability to realize the possibilities of making changes that would in the end mean that more could be done for the same budget.
Thank you very much, Tania. Ian, would you like to come in?
Well, I think it's a great question, because I think, as Tania says, it really gets to the heart of this in a lot of ways. That when I first started looking at these issues maybe 12 or 13 years ago, a lot of decision makers wouldn't even use the word well-being. I thought it was fluffy and meaningless and so on. They're all happy to use it now. What it means is another issue. So looking at it on a kind of macro scale, I mean, this was a Conservative-led David Cameron government that really put this on the agenda in the UK in 2010 and talked about the need to not think about GDP, but GWB, the general well-being, and what matters is quality of life and all of these kind of things. And at the same time, introducing policies that introduce cuts to the very organisations that might deliver it, and so on and so forth. So we've had a lot of symbolic policy around this. And even in some of the places like Wales and like Scotland, where it seems to have been moving a little bit more central into the kind of policy framework, it's not clear what impact it's been having. So I think these are big questions. I guess the answer is that you get it right into the kind of, you get ideas about well-being right into the early stages of thinking about policy decisions in the appraisal stage. Obviously what New Zealand is doing is probably as advanced as anywhere, where to get something approved, it has to go through certain well-being tests before it will be funded. And then building it into the outcomes framework, which of course they've started to do in Scotland, having the appropriate indicators and then resourcing it all. But I think it's a great question. I think there is a danger that this just becomes a rhetoric, a kind of symbolic idea, and in worst case scenarios can be used to distract people from the reality of what's going on. So we'll talk about well-being and we'll do the other. I'm not sure I've got any better answers than saying it's a great question. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. I mean, I think we're all profoundly aware that the politics that govern many of our countries, and particularly perhaps those of us who are in the UK feel this particularly acutely at the moment, is there's a lot left to be desired in terms of trying to align values, particularly values which are sometimes quite well articulated and perhaps have found their way into legislation, but actually turning that into practical and a commitment to make the structural changes, some of which are related to the inequalities which have emerged in our society, is lacking, and that's something where I think researchers as well as others need to call out some of the empty rhetoric that we hear around some of these issues. So that's something perhaps we could think about. I'm going to take one more question that's been contributed before I invite panelists to make their last few comments. Before I ask that question, I want to thank everyone who's put very nice comments into the chat, both about the quality of the contributions made by the panelists, but also about Annie and her work. And we'll find a way of putting those into a blog or some other way to make sure that some of those comments can be shared more widely. But I have a question from Cone Bartels, who says, Annie's profound work really resonates with my own in many ways. I'm very grateful for the thoughtful and touching ways in which the speakers have introduced it. I'm committed to promoting transition to governance grounded in relational values, but in my experience, it is still exceedingly difficult to convincingly articulate what this means, how it works, and what difference it makes in practice in the face of the hegemony of neoliberal thinking. So this is about promoting relational values. What strategies could we pursue to change this? Who would like to have a go at that before we conclude? Karen?
A few people have mentioned this idea of how do we get sociality into our institutions, or how do institutions promote that? And I found myself through the panel coming back to my PhD studies, where I interviewed a lot of residents in a local authority in the northeast about well-being and what well-being meant in terms of trying to put indicators together for a local authority. And I remember being really struck by, and it comes back to this ageing in place as well, really struck by particularly older people who find themselves on their own at the end of life, and the real importance of everyday sort of spontaneous relationships with shopkeepers, taxi drivers, bus drivers, just people they meet and bump into in town. So they've lost a lot of their social networks because people have died, friends have died, or family have moved away. And so the importance of chance encounters with strangers becomes so important. And it can either make your day feel good, or it can make it not feel good if somebody's mean to you or grumpy, or, you know. So those chance encounters become much more heightened. And I've often thought that there needs to be some recognition that when perhaps local authorities are challenged to increase sort of sociality, they should also think about things that they're putting in place that decrease it. And I'll give you one really tiny example that somebody told me during that research that's always stayed with me. And he said, when I drive out to park my car in this car park that he uses often, you used to be able to just pay and get a ticket. And then if you left early, you could find somebody in the car park who needed a ticket, and you could pass your ticket to them. And often you'd have a bit of chat. But now we have to put in our registration plate, so we actually can't pass our ticket. We're not allowed to do that very small kindness. And that's a tiny, tiny example of the sort of, I guess, the invisible networks of sociality that are gradually being eroded by a focus on economy. And as local authorities get more and more stretched, they're looking for more and more ways to do that sort of thing. So I think in a way, it's the micro grain of this that's as important as focusing on government. And often trying to focus on the current government is a waste of time because they've already got their agendas. You know, if you want to focus on government, you need to work at the shadow cabinet level often. So I think, and trade unions and, professional associations and all of those, and meso institutions like universities, schools, employers, businesses, what are they doing to facilitate well-being? So I think, gosh, there's an awful lot I could say. I keep having to stop myself.
I think you've made some good points there, Karen, and what you said there resonates very much with me. My heart sank recently when I went into my local branch of Boots to find that we now have to queue up in order to scan our own purchases, and the little conversations that people used to have with the sales personnel are no longer permissible. And I thought that's going to be hard for some people that those local shops. We're running out of time. Does anyone want to pick up that the points that Karen made before I give each of you a chance to make a final comment? Okay, so we need to conclude promptly at 10:30, so we've got a couple of minutes left, and I'd just like to ask each of you just to reflect on if there's one thing about Annie's work that you'd like the audience to take away from this conversation and to think about and try to apply either in their research, in their politics, or in their life. What would it be? Who'd like to go first? Tania.
Thanks. Yes. Well, I think the thing that I feel I've taken from Annie's work, and it's not every day that you really feel you've learned something and been humbled by, in my case, a PhD student's work that you've had the opportunity to read, but it was very much the case for me when I encountered Annie's work, is her intellectual courage. I don't think I've ever come across somebody at that stage in their career who was willing and able to take on such enormous questions and tackle them with such openness and skill. And that ability to see those big questions and have the courage to address them, not to be hiding away in some little corner, specialist corner of a discipline where you might be able to make your mark in some tiny field, but to really identify what are the most important questions facing us and tackle them in the best way you know how, is something that I certainly feel I've learnt to admire in Annie's work, and I would certainly like to take forward in my own work, and perhaps other people might as well.
Thank you, Tania. Ian, do you want to? What would you draw attention to?
I think just to follow on from Tania, I think she was courageous in her one-to-one exchanges as well, as I remember. As a PhD student and me as a professor, she definitely argued her case incredibly well, kept her ground, persuaded me of her arguments, and so on. And I think, just looking at the acknowledgement to her book, and I think the last line is that nothing matters as much as connection with others is kind of central to Annie's work. And then just going back to that paper that I talked about, the things that she was saying about the sort of hegemony of happiness, certainly within the UK, but more widely, is even truer now than it was when she put the paper together. So I think remembering on the one hand the importance of those connections and being central, but actually some of the dangers inherent in forgetting that and accepting this kind of individualized conception of well-being, I think is central to what Annie was arguing about, really. So I think that's what I would take away.
Thanks very much. Karen?
Yes, all of that. Relationships matter, the baseline, and she argued that beautifully. But also, I think the integrity, the other thing that she wanted to highlight at the end of the book, to live in accordance with your own values. And I think Annie's interest in Aristotelian ethics and philosophy, and she was interested in that not just as an intellectual practice, but really as really to bring that into life, in her own life, and to bring that out in her work to encourage real practical change. She really lived in accordance with her own values, and I think that's the lesson that we can all take from her. Really, she was quite courageous and fierce in that, and that's something I really appreciated about her. And in terms of relationships, she was just a great person to have around, and that makes work as a researcher and an academic so much nicer. She was a lot of fun, and we had some laughs. So I think relationships matter, and integrity.
Thank you, Karen. And Patrick, do you want to make a brief comment as well?
Yeah, not a huge amount to add to those fantastic comments, but I think, for me, I think I've taken heart from her book in particular that it's possible to maintain a commitment to the idea that there are things that, that we share as human beings and that are good for us as human beings, while being sensitive to different cultural manifestations and expressions of that. And that's something that's, been really inspiring for me hopefully going forward in my doctoral studies. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks to all of you. I think for me, the thing I would draw attention to that really struck me when I read her book, which I didn't read until after Annie had died, was the focus on the whole of the world and the looking back into history and to historical contributions to thought as a source of inspiration and to really bring all of that together in the way that Karen expressed very clearly how well she pulls that off. But I think it's really is an inspiring contribution. Annie shone a very bright light on some of the crucial issues of our time, and we should be very grateful for what she has left us, and make sure that we draw attention to her work in our own writings and in the students that we teach, and ensure that the advances that she made, which I think are really genuine and important, are also feed into future advances in this important area of thought. I'd like to thank all the panelists for taking the time to prepare and to participate in this panel, which I think all of us have been proud to do. And I'd particularly like to thank Stephen and his husband for agreeing that we could do this, and to thank Annie's friend who I first spoke to after Annie's death about how we might honour Annie for encouraging me in the idea of holding this panel at the conference, because I think we've been able to have an important conversation this morning, which I hope will inspire many people to work with Annie's ideas into the future. Thank you very much to everyone for joining the call, for your questions, for your comments, and to the panelists for their contributions, and to our technical team behind the scenes for making this all possible. Thank you all very much indeed. And I hope some of you will look forward to enjoying some of the other contributions in the conference, which remain this week, including Joan Tronto's keynote speech, which will be delivered this afternoon in a few hours' time. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Sue.